Hello, my dear friends. How is the world treating you today? I hope wherever you are, there is at least a small pocket of peace around you. Maybe a warm drink at your side, or simply the comfort of knowing you are not alone in this vast and beautiful world. Let me ask you something. Have you ever seen an elderly stranger passing quietly down the street? Weathered face, tired shoulders, eyes carrying storms you cannot see, and wondered what silent battles still live inside his heart? Or maybe, late at night, you have felt like a traveler in your own life, searching not for glory, not for riches, but simply for a place where your soul may finally rest. Today's story takes us to a mist-covered coastal town called Northwind Cove, where the sea sings old songs and the wind remembers secrets. It is the story of a former Navy SEAL who wished only to disappear, and a silver-coated German shepherd who was feared because he looked too much like a wolf. Two wandering souls, two hearts bruised by the world. Yet when everyone else turned away, they chose to stand beside each other, and somehow that was enough to keep the light alive. This tale reminds us that sometimes kindness is the greatest courage, and that loyalty can speak louder than 1,000 words. It reminds us that God often sends miracles not in shining chariots, but in fur, in scars, and in quiet love. So, if you are ready to walk with me along the storm-kissed shore and listen to the waves whisper about faith, redemption, and home, then please pull up a chair and join our little family by clicking the subscribe button. The winter skies sagged low over Northwind Cove, Washington, like a tired blanket that no one had the strength to shake out. Gray clouds hovered close to the rooftops, heavy with the promise of rain that had not yet decided quite when to fall. The Pacific rolled below them in long pewter-colored waves that struck the rocky shoreline again and again, as though trying to remember some ancient rhythm. The air smelled of salt, damp rope, diesel oil from old fishing boats, and the kind of cold that worked quietly into bones. A few seagulls wheeled overhead, calling sharply, but otherwise the town felt muted. Sleepy storefronts, a weather-beaten pier, and a narrow main street that sloped gently toward the sea. Into this quiet scene stepped Morgan Hale, a man who carried the past the way others carried luggage, visible only if you looked closely at the strain in his shoulders. He was 63 years old, tall but slightly stooped, with the deliberate movements of someone accustomed to conserving strength. His hair, once black, now lay silver-gray and unruly around his ears and collar, as though the wind had long ago claimed ownership of it. A short beard softened the lines of his face, but the true story lived in his pale storm-gray eyes, eyes that had watched danger and grief long enough to become cautious friends with both. He wore a worn, wax-cotton coat the color of old earth, patched carefully at the elbows, a pair of faded jeans, and boots whose scuffed leather carried the geography of many places. When he walked, his left leg lagged just slightly behind the right, a shrapnel memory from a desert too far away to matter anymore, except that it never let him forget. Beside him walked Rowan, a German shepherd of 8 years who looked like he had been carved from winter itself. His fur shimmered in layers of silver and smoke gray, thick and dense against the cold. He was tall, strong, and graceful, but there was nothing aggressive in his movement. His ears stood alert, his amber eyes calm and calculating, reading the world with the quiet intelligence of a creature who understood danger and loyalty in equal measure. A thin, pale scar curved faintly around his neck, an old wound from a chain that once held too tightly, now replaced by a soft leather collar worn smooth with care. Rowan matched his stride perfectly to Morgan's slower pace, occasionally brushing his shoulder gently against the man's leg in a silent reminder. I am here. You are not alone. He did not bark. He rarely needed to. The coastal bus sighed to a stop at the end of Main Street and released them into the wind. The driver, Tommy Jenkins, a man in his mid-40s with a round middle and an almost bald head that always looked slightly sunburned, glanced back at them over his shoulder. Tommy had a friendly enough nature, quick with jokes for regulars, but he also possessed that small-town instinct to measure strangers carefully. He recognized ex-military posture when he saw it, the straight back, the awareness in the eyes. He noticed the caneless limp. He noticed the dog. He gave Morgan a polite nod, respectful but reserved. Morgan returned the smallest tilt of his head, a greeting without weight or invitation, and the bus rumbled away, leaving only the echo of its departure. Morgan stood still for a moment, simply breathing in the air. He did not arrive with fanfare, nor with plan beyond rest, perhaps. There are men who flee their ghosts and men who walk beside them. Morgan was the latter. Northwind Cove had not called to him with promise, merely with silence, and silence was something he could live with. Their arrival did not stay private for long. Northwind Cove was the kind of town where curtains were part fabric, part social filter. From Harper's Grocery, a narrow store with green paint that peeled like molting snakeskin, stepped Martha Harper, tall, sharp-boned, late 50s, with a mouth trained into a skeptical line. Her gray hair was tied back in a strict bun, and her cardigan hung around her shoulders as if protecting her from the world rather than the cold. Years ago she had lost her only son to the sea, a fishing accident that left her quieter, less trusting of anything unexpected. When she saw Rowan first, her eyes sharpened. The dog looked too much like a wolf, too wild, too capable. She clutched her grocery bag closer to her chest without realizing she'd done it. She was not unkind, only wary, because loss had taught her that life rarely gave gifts without price. Down at the pier, Eddie Collins, a wiry fisherman of 32 with hands perpetually smelling of brine and diesel, paused mid-coil of rope. Eddie had the kind of face that always looked amused, even when he wasn't. He squinted at Rowan, then at Morgan, then elbowed the man beside him, a silent exchange that said, "You see that?" Eddie wasn't cruel, just young enough to trust gossip and old enough to repeat it. Morgan and Rowan began to walk slowly along Main Street. The duffel bag slung over Morgan's shoulder had clearly seen more miles than he liked to count. Frayed seams, careful patches, a handle grip worn down until the fabric felt like silk. With each step the limp spoke softly. Rowan stayed pressed close to his side, poised but calm, tail low, scanning faces and doorways without suspicion, simply aware. People watched, as people do. A teenage girl peered out from behind the fogged window of the diner. A mechanic in oil-stained overalls leaned halfway out of the garage bay to stare. A mother gently pulled her little boy closer as Morgan and Rowan passed. Words were not spoken aloud, not yet, but impressions moved swiftly through the unspoken network that links small-town hearts. Rough, military, dangerous dog, doesn't look like he belongs. Morgan heard none of it directly, though years of experience told him all he needed. He did not resent them. Fear was a familiar language. They reached a small wooden bench overlooking the sea, its paint long since surrendering to the elements. Morgan eased himself down onto it, moving with the practiced economy of someone who had learned that the body was both tool and betrayer. He rested his elbows casually on his knees and let his gaze drift out across the restless water. Rowan lowered himself gracefully beside the bench, folding his legs beneath him, head lifting and swiveling gently as he tracked every sound. A stray shaft of sunlight sliced briefly through the clouds, catching Rowan's silver coat and making him seem almost unreal, like some ancient guardian spirit assigned to watch over weary wanderers. If myth had a shape, it might look like him. But myth does little to calm suspicion. The door of the grocery shut firmly. The mechanic disappeared into shadow. Someone whispered. Someone else frowned. The town, unsure, cautious, shaped by years of little change, wrapped itself a little tighter against the presence of the stranger, and the silver-furred dog. Morgan did not flinch. He had been misunderstood before. He lifted a slow hand and let his fingers brush behind Rowan's ear. Rowan leaned into the touch almost imperceptibly, as steady and dependable as the tides. Together they sat quietly, looking out toward the gray horizon, saying nothing, asking for nothing, simply existing beneath the low winter sky while Northwind Cove kept its careful distance. And so their story began, not with cheers, not with welcome, but with silence, suspicion, and the wind whispering across the restless sea. The next morning, the sky over Northwind Cove had lightened from iron to pewter, though the clouds still dragged themselves lazily above the rooftops, as if unsure whether to weep or simply brood. The sea remained restless, its waves rising and falling in long silver strokes across the rocks. Morgan Hale sat again on the weathered bench overlooking the water. Rowan stretched on the ground beside him like a living statue carved from winter. They had slept in a small, sheltered corner near the pier, wrapped in silence and cold air. Morgan looked tired, but uncomplaining. Rowan, ever alert, watched every passer-by with quiet calculation. A boy appeared along the path that traced the edge of the rocky shoreline. He could not have been more than 8. His name was Nathan Reed, a pale, slender child with sandy hair that flopped over his forehead and knees that bore the faint scars of ordinary childhood accidents. His coat was thin for the season, suggesting a family that did what it could, but not always what it wished. Nathan had the wide-eyed curiosity of children who still believe the world might surprise them kindly. He wandered closer to the rocks, fascinated by the waves curling and collapsing in white foam. There was a sign further up the path, warning of slippery stone, but Nathan either had not seen it or, as children sometimes do, believed himself immune to danger. The rock beneath his foot tilted. His arms flew out in a startled attempt at balance. A small cry escaped him as he slipped toward the jagged edge where water slapped hungrily at stone. Rowan moved before thought had time to stretch fully awake. His body flowed from stillness into motion with a grace born of instinct and training long past. He surged across the path, powerful legs carrying him in a blur of silver fur and amber eyes focused completely. Morgan was a half-step behind, slower because of the old wound that tugged at his stride, but his voice cut the air low and firm, not harsh, simply commanding Rowan onward. The dog reached Nathan just as the boy's shoe lost its hold. Rowan pushed his chest against the child's side, guiding him back from the edge with startling gentleness for such strength. His jaws never opened. He did not growl. He simply braced himself, body tense as cable, until Nathan regained his footing and dropped to a shaky crouch on the path, breathing quickly and staring into those amber eyes, filled not with threat, but with absolute calm. For a second, there was only silence. Then voices rose. A woman ran toward them from farther up the path. Her name was Linda Reed, Nathan's mother. She was in her mid-30s, with exhausted eyes framed by faint lines that suggested too little rest and too many worries. Her brown hair was hurriedly tied back, strands escaping to whip across her face in the breeze. She worked double shifts at the laundry on the edge of town, which had given her a habit of moving quickly while always appearing one step behind her own life. Fear sharpened her features as she scooped Nathan into her arms, checking every inch of him with trembling hands. When she looked up and saw Rowan standing so close to her son, protective and imposing, fear transformed into something harder. Her voice cracked with panic as she told Morgan to keep his dangerous animal away. Others gathered, drawn by the raised voices. Eddie Collins was there, wiping salt from his hands on his jacket. Martha Harper appeared on the path, more rigid than the wind itself. A couple of fishermen stared, their expressions tightening. To them, the image could be misread, a large wolf-like dog standing over a frightened child. Rowan sensed the mood shift and instinctively stepped back to Morgan's side, body coiled but calm, ears forward, posture neutral. He had done his job. He would not escalate. Morgan spoke then. His voice was low, roughened by years and dust and unspoken things. He said only that the boy had slipped, that Rowan had steadied him. He did not justify, did not plead, did not argue. He merely offered truth as simply as one might place a stone upon a table. But fear does not always listen to truth. Linda thanked him stiffly, yet still clung to her son, eyes darting between man and dog with suspicion that had nowhere else to sit. Eddie muttered that dogs that size always cause trouble, sooner or later. Martha crossed her arms, lips pressed thin, feeling again the old ache of loss and the impulse to protect what remained. Rowan leaned subtly into Morgan's leg. Morgan's hand came to rest briefly against the dog's neck. It was not reassurance, it was recognition. Two survivors acknowledging the rising wall between themselves and the rest of the world. Further up Main Street, the town's only bakery glowed like a small hearth against the cold. Warm light spilled from its windows, golden and soft, carrying with it the scent of fresh bread, cinnamon, and sugar. This shop belonged to Evelyn Carter, a woman of 58 with hair the color of pale wheat, braided loosely down her back. She was not tall, but she carried herself with a kind of quiet steadiness, as if grounded deeply into the earth beneath her feet. Her face held both laugh lines and grief lines, woven together gently by time. Years earlier, the sea had taken her husband during a storm that arrived too quickly for warnings. The loss had been sharp enough to hollow her for a long while, yet instead of growing hard, she had chosen a softer armor. She baked, she listened, she decided deliberately to believe that kindness could still be a form of survival. When she stepped outside to shake crumbs from a cloth, she saw the small knot of townspeople near the path. She saw the frightened mother, the alert fisherman, the scarred man who stood quiet as stone, and the silver dog watching everything with fierce devotion. She did not rush toward drama. She simply observed. Nathan wriggled out of his mother's arms long enough to say that the dog had saved him. He spoke plainly, not dramatically, simply stating what had happened in the honest way of children who do not yet understand the weight of reputation. There was a pause. No one accused the boy of lying, but neither did fear fully loosen its grip. The group broke apart eventually. People had nets to mend, bread to buy, hours to fill. Linda Reed led Nathan home with a tighter hold than before. Martha shook her head but said nothing. Eddie muttered again that the town had been simpler without strangers. Winter wind carried away the whispers like smoke. For the remainder of the day, Morgan and Rowan moved quietly along the outskirts of the town's rhythm. They ate little. They spoke to no one unless spoken to. Rowan stayed close, a silent sentinel. They were used to existing on the edge of other people's stories. Late afternoon dipped toward evening, and a chill deeper than the sea crept into the air. Morgan stood outside the bakery for a long moment, warming his hands near the small vent, where heat slipped out. The scent of fresh bread wrapped around him like memory. Rowan sat neatly at his heel, calm and watchful. Evelyn Carter noticed. She stepped into the doorway, wiping her hands on a flour-dusted cloth. Her eyes met Morgan's. There was no accusation there, only curiosity, and something like recognition. She had seen that gaze before in widows, in sailors returned from storms, in the mirror. She greeted him gently, her voice warm but steady, the voice of someone accustomed to offering comfort without demanding gratitude. She asked nothing about his past. Instead, she asked a question so ordinary it almost startled him. Whether he and the dog had eaten? Morgan hesitated. Pride can become another wound if left unattended. But Evelyn's calm presence did not press. She simply waited, as if time itself could be kind. He nodded once. She welcomed them through the side door that opened to the back room where sacks of flour lay stacked and the old brick oven radiated deep, living heat. The space smelled of yeast and slow patience. Rowan paused at the threshold, glancing to Morgan for permission. At a soft murmur, he entered and settled near the oven, body easing into the warmth, eyes still alert but softening. Evelyn saw everything. The way the dog watched the world yet trusted the man completely. The way the man carried pain like a folded note in his pocket, never shown, but always near. She did not ask questions. She poured tea for Morgan and set a plate of warm bread and butter before him as if it were the most natural thing in the world. Her kindness was not dramatic. It flowed as quietly as the tide and was just as steady. When she learned they had nowhere to stay, she considered carefully. She was not reckless, but grief had taught her that people break in silence, and sometimes all they need is a small place where no one stares. She offered them use of the tiny storage room behind the bakery, near the oven where it stayed warm at night. Not forever, just for now. Morgan opened his mouth as if to refuse. Then he closed it again. Gratitude flickered like a shy light behind his eyes. He thanked her simply. Rowan thumped his tail once upon the floor, barely audible, but sincere. Outside, Northwind Cove remained cautious. Suspicion lingered like sea mist that never truly left the harbor. Yet within the soft glow of Evelyn Carter's bakery, warmth wrapped itself gently around two weary travelers and asked nothing in return. And so, while others whispered their worries to one another, a small corner of the world chose kindness, and the stranger with the silver dog found shelter beside the breathing heart of a brick oven. The storm clouds drifted, the sea murmured, and night gathered softly around the town that did not yet know how deeply its life was beginning to change. Morning broke with a strange brightness in Northwind Cove, the kind that arrives after a night of uneasy calm when the sky feels scrubbed clean yet restless beneath its polished blue. The gulls carved lazy circles above the harbor, calling sharply as if gossiping about the people below. Boats rocked gently at their moorings, their ropes creaking like tired bones. From the back of the bakery, where the brick oven still held the ghost of warmth from the early bake, Morgan Hale stepped out with Rowan at his side. Morgan's shoulders were a little less hunched today, as if the quiet kindness of shelter had smoothed, if only slightly, the weight of years pressing against him. Rowan moved with silent precision, ears tuned to every small sound of the waking harbor. Across the street, townspeople began their ordinary routines. Salt-streaked fishermen carried coils of rope, boots thumping against the dock. One of them, a middle-aged man named Carl Hewitt, passed by with a nod. Carl had sunburned skin and the broad shoulders of someone born to the sea. He did not speak much, but his eyes were steady, the way of a man who measured life by tides instead of clocks. He gave Morgan a cautious glance, curious but not unkind. Rowan watched him calmly, the quiet way guardians sometimes choose not to speak unless needed. The day might have remained ordinary if not for the scream. It tore across the harbor like a ripped sail, desperate and raw. Morgan's head snapped toward the source instinctively. Down the dock, a woman ran toward the edge of the pier, her hands pressed against her mouth. Her name was Denise Miller, a thin woman in her 40s with hair tied too tightly, as though control over her appearance might grant control over her life. Worry had carved itself deep into her features long before this day, shaped by a life built on fragile fishing nets and uncertain weather. Today, that fear broke through completely. A small fishing trawler was drifting crookedly just beyond the breakwater, its engine silent, its bow listing awkwardly. Smoke curled faintly from the cabin, carrying with it the faint, bitter scent of something gone wrong. Two figures were waving frantically on deck, while another voice, faint, panicked, rose somewhere near the stern. Without drama, without hesitation, Morgan began to move. He did not run wildly. Instead, he walked with brisk, purposeful strides, every muscle falling into a rhythm that had been engraved into him across decades. Rowan followed at his heel, posture sharpening as though a hidden switch had clicked inside him. There was no barking, no panic, only fierce focus. At the pier's edge, boats strained against their ropes. A small motor skiff bobbed untended. Morgan scanned quickly, assessing currents, distance, approach angles. He called to Carl, his voice calm, yet instantly commanding. Carl responded before he even understood why. Something in Morgan's tone, quiet, absolute, made obedience feel natural. 2 more men appeared. One was Jonah Pike, a wiry man with a salt and pepper beard and quick, darting eyes, known for his talkative nature and a lifetime of harmless tall tales. The other was Bethany Rhodes, tall and broad-shouldered, with cropped dark hair and the hardened efficiency of someone who had learned to take control because life rarely gave her any. Bethany had lost a brother to a storm years back, and since then she had rarely trusted anyone to handle an emergency better than herself. Today, though, she listened. Morgan stepped aboard the skiff like a man returning to an old room he had left reluctantly. His movements were fluid and spare, no wasted motion. He told Carl to untie the stern line, Bethany to hold the bow rope for timing, Jonah to grab the emergency medical kit stored in the dockside locker. He did not explain himself. He did not need to. His words were anchors, and people clung to them. Rowan leapt lightly into the skiff, settling near the bow, alert and balanced. The dog's eyes never stopped scanning the water. Morgan gave the engine a steady pull. It sputtered, then roared awake. They shot across the harbor, slicing through water that glinted like hammered steel beneath the pale sun. As they closed in on the damaged trawler, the crackle of panic became clearer. Smoke drifted from the cabin door. A man in his 50s, red-faced and heaving for breath, shouted about an engine flare-up and someone trapped below deck. Morgan's mind sharpened further, stripping life down to decisions. He guided the skiff alongside and lashed it fast with the ease of repetition. Then he moved aboard the trawler, Rowan following only when Morgan gestured. The dog remained poised, knowing that control mattered. Below deck, a young deckhand had fallen when the engine had lurched and was now wedged beneath a storage crate. His name, they learned later, was Tyler Hayes, barely 20, with freckles across his nose and that particular look of youth that believes adulthood must somehow make more sense than it actually does. His breathing was fast and shallow. Panic had wrapped itself around him like rope. Morgan crouched and spoke to Tyler with a voice that had once soothed terrified soldiers in lands far from this quiet coast. Calm, grounded, real. He directed Jonah and Carl to lever the crate up using a nearby pry bar, told Bethany to clear space for movement, guided each action with precise timing. When the crate finally shifted free, Morgan pulled Tyler out, lifting him with surprising strength for a man his age. Rowan leaned forward, sniffing gently at the boy's arm, as if to confirm he was whole. They brought Tyler to the deck, where he clung to breath like a rescued memory. Smoke thickened, but the situation stabilized. Bethany doused the remaining embers around the engine with seawater, strong arms moving with grim purpose. The danger receded like the outgoing tide. Only then did Morgan allow himself a slow exhale. Silence spread across the trawler and then across the harbor itself, as if even the sea paused to listen. The townspeople on the dock had watched everything. They had seen a stooped stranger transform the chaos of an unfolding accident into something navigable, almost inevitable. They had seen a silver dog that never once lost control, never barked blindly, never faltered. And they began to wonder. Who was this man who spoke like command and moved like memory? What life had carved those maps of experience into the lines of his face? What storms had he survived before arriving quietly among them, asking for nothing more than a corner of warmth and peace? By the time the skiff carried them back to the pier, the harbor had filled with more residents. Word travels fast in small towns, faster still when sharpened by rumor and salt wind. Linda Reed stood there with Nathan, the boy's eyes wide with awe. Martha Harper hovered slightly apart, posture stiff yet uncertain. Even those who had spoken harshly before found themselves silent. Tyler's mother arrived. A short woman with broad hands and worry-chiseled expression, she clung to her son fiercely. Tears streaked freely down her cheeks. She could barely form words of gratitude. Morgan accepted them with a nod and nothing more. Compliments slid off him like water off stone. Rowan received a hesitant pat on the head from Nathan Reed. The boy whispered his thanks. Rowan blinked, solemn and steady, as though acknowledging a pact between protectors. Evelyn Carter watched everything from the bakery doorway, her expression soft with knowing. She had suspected something beyond ordinary hardship clung to Morgan like a shadow. Now she understood that he had not come to this town empty. He had come bearing a life filled with dangerous skill and silent courage, gifts he had never intended to display. Whispers rose. Military man, captain, rescuer, ghost. Curiosity grew, no longer sharpened by suspicion, but warmed with reluctant respect. Morgan said little. He returned to the back of the bakery quietly, Rowan at his heel, disappearing into warmth and dough-scented air. Yet by sundown, the harbor carried a new story across its waters, and the people of Northwind Cove lay awake, hearing the echo of the calm, commanding voice of the man the sea seemed to recognize. The morning after the rescue arrived pale and hushed, as though the sea itself were holding its breath. A thin veil of mist hovered over Northwind Cove, softening rooftops and turning the boats into faint silhouettes, swaying gently at their moorings. The town woke slowly. Doors opened. Footsteps sounded on damp planks. Coffee steam curled upward like prayers. Beneath it all ran a current of quiet curiosity. Whispers had drifted through the town like drifting tideweed through still water. The stranger with the silver dog, the trawler, the calm voice, the hands that did not shake. Questions had begun to take root. Inside the bakery, Evelyn Carter worked the morning dough with steady hands. She wore her usual flour-dusted apron, her pale wheat braid falling over one shoulder. Her face was thoughtful, eyes soft with something between gratitude and concern. In the small storage room at the back, Morgan Hale sat on a simple wooden chair, Rowan lying at his feet. Morgan looked as he always did, worn, quiet, and watchful. Yet there was a stillness in him that was not merely fatigue. It was the stillness of a man waiting for something he had long expected might eventually find him. Rowan rested his head across Morgan's boot, amber eyes half-lidded, yet alert to any shift in the air. By mid-morning, a black sedan pulled into Northwind Cove, its paint dusty from the long coastal road. It did not look like the ordinary vehicles of fishermen or townsfolk. It looked official. From the driver's seat stepped a woman in her late 40s named Julia Thompson. Julia was average height but carried herself with disciplined posture. Her dark hair, streaked faintly with gray at the temples, was tied neatly back. She wore a simple navy coat and carried a leather folder under one arm. Julia had once been an Army medic before becoming a coordinator for the Veterans Support Council. Years of treating wounded men and navigating red tape had left her with calm eyes and a no-nonsense edge softened by compassion. She did not rush. She listened. And when she decided something mattered, she moved mountains to tend it. She walked into the bakery, the small bell chiming sharply against the quiet morning. Evelyn looked up, greeting her with a warmth that never felt rehearsed. Julia asked with professional politeness whether a man named Morgan Hale might be staying there. The name hung in the air. Evelyn did not look surprised. She simply wiped her hands on her apron and said yes, then asked gently whether there was a problem. Julia smiled faintly and said no. Quite the opposite. A few minutes later, Morgan stepped into the front shop. His simple jacket hung loosely on his shoulders, and faint lines deepened at the corner of his eyes as he regarded Julia. He recognized the bearing immediately. Old instincts moved like ghosts beneath the surface of his expression. Rowan came to stand beside him, tall and poised, coat shimmering silver beneath the warm bakery lights. Julia introduced herself and spoke plainly. The Veteran Support Council had received word of him through the regional network. Someone had reported a rescue at Northwind Cove involving a man named Hale. That name had stirred records that were not easily forgotten. She asked, gently but directly, whether he was the same Morgan Hale once attached to Naval Special Operations Command, the one whose name still lingered in training halls like a quiet legend. The bakery fell silent. Evelyn paused mid-motion. A fisherman at the counter stopped stirring his coffee. Even the oven seemed to hush its low-breathing hum. Morgan did not deny it. He spoke simply. "Yes," Julia continued softly. She explained that he had once been Commander Morgan Hale, a Navy SEAL team leader known for impossible rescues, quiet leadership, and a refusal to abandon anyone under his command. Years earlier, he had received the Medal of Honor for leading a perilous extraction under conditions so severe that even seasoned officers rarely spoke of it without a tone of reverence. The details had not been loud. Morgan had never sought attention, but truth leaves echoes. The names and ribbons had never been why he served, which perhaps was why he had disappeared so easily afterward. Word rippled through the town with astonishing speed, carried in voices filled no longer with suspicion, but with dawning awe. Carl Hewitt told the harbor men. Martha Harper heard it from the grocer, who heard it from a patron, who had heard it from a niece, who had heard it from the baker's assistant. Linda Reed tightened her hold on Nathan and murmured quietly that she had misjudged him. People who had once watched Morgan with wary distance now found themselves unsure whether to approach or bow their heads in respect. Rowan, too, began to be seen differently. No longer a dangerous, wolf-like presence, he became the steadfast guardian who had served beside a warrior, trained and disciplined, loyal beyond measure. Mothers told their children softly that heroes did not always look the way storybooks suggested. Sometimes they wore worn jackets and carried grief with gentle hands. Julia Thompson arranged to meet with Morgan privately at a table in the back. Evelyn brought tea, but did not linger. She believed in giving space to stories that needed room to breathe. Julia explained that support was available, medical assistance for his injured knee, financial resources he had never claimed, housing options if he wished. She did not insist. She merely offered. Morgan listened. He agreed to accept only what Rowan might need. Respect rose then in quiet layers across Northwind Cove. It was not loud or theatrical. It appeared in small gestures, men offering a nod that felt more like a salute, women speaking his name with softened tone, townsfolk stepping aside, not from fear, but from reverence. Martha Harper, who had once bristled with suspicion, approached Evelyn later that afternoon with an expression touched by humility. She admitted she had been wrong. Her voice trembled slightly, shaped by old grief. She said perhaps she had feared strength because she once lost someone strong to the sea. Evelyn placed a hand over hers without judgment. As for Morgan, he did not change his habits. He still rose early, walked the harbor path, spoke little, and stayed mostly in the shadows of ordinary life. Only now the shadows had grown warmer. People no longer pulled children back when Rowan passed. Instead, young Nathan Reed greeted the dog with shy admiration, and Rowan, dignified and serene, allowed it. The harbor, so long accustomed to weathering storms of wind and wave, found itself softened by a different tide: gratitude. And quietly beneath it all, the town began to carry his story with honor. They still did not know the full depths of the man, but they now understood this. Northwind Cove was sheltering not merely a stranger, it was sheltering a legend disguised as a weary traveler. And day by day, respect began to take the place where doubt once stood. The sky over Northwind Cove had begun to clear in reluctant streaks of pale blue, as though the clouds were slowly lifting their gray cloaks from the rooftops. The sea shimmered under weak sunlight, restless but calmer than in the days before. Yet beneath this surface calm, another kind of turbulence grew quietly within the walls of the town hall, where Silas Beckett, the mayor of Northwind Cove, sat alone at his desk. Silas was a man in his early 50s, his once dark hair now peppered with gray that gathered most thickly around his temples. He had the broad shoulders of a man who had worked hard in his youth, and the softening waistline of one who now worked mostly at a desk. His face bore strong lines across the brow and around the mouth, etched by years of decision-making and quiet worries. He dressed neatly but modestly, often in pressed shirts and worn jackets, rather than the fine suits of wealthier leaders elsewhere. His brown eyes were thoughtful but carried an undertone of unease, as if he constantly listened for an approaching storm no one else could yet hear. He had not always been mayor. Years earlier, he had worked as a property agent, arranging modest sales between fishermen, retirees, and those seeking quiet coastal life. But when the former mayor retired, the town had turned to Silas because he seemed steady and reliable. And he did care, deeply, though his care sometimes took the shape of anxiety rather than courage. Now, scattered across his desk, lay thick folders stamped with the branding of North Shore Development Group. Their representative, Patrick Lowell, had arrived in town 3 months before. Patrick was a tall, lean man in his 40s, with hair too perfectly combed and a smile that always looked rehearsed. His suits were trimmed precisely, his shoes unmarked by salt or sand, and his voice carried the silk-smooth cadence of someone well accustomed to persuasion. Patrick spoke of revitalizing the coastline, building luxury cottages, modern marinas, boutique hotels. He spoke of jobs, tax revenue, prosperity. But beneath every polished word lay a quiet hunger: land acquisition, buyouts, relocation proposals. The land in question belonged to fishermen whose families had lived there for generations. Silas worried. He worried about the shrinking town budget, the aging infrastructure, the young people leaving for cities. He worried that refusing North Shore would condemn Northwind Cove to slow decline. And now, with the revelation of Morgan Hale's true identity echoing throughout the town, Silas felt his sense of control slipping further from his fingers like wet rope through gloved hands. That morning, Patrick Lowell stood in Silas's office. Up close, Patrick's charm looked almost like a mask, handsome but slightly too polished to trust. His blue eyes were bright but calculating, absorbing every twitch and hesitation in those around him. He spoke with easy confidence, leaning forward only as much as necessary to seem engaged rather than imposing. He reminded Silas gently yet firmly of pending deadlines. Investors expected progress. They needed signatures. They needed land transferred quietly, efficiently. And, Patrick added with a faint narrowing of the eyes, it was wise for towns to maintain stability. Unexpected figures, legendary soldiers turned reclusive strangers, could stir unwanted sentiment and disrupt negotiations. Silas stiffened at that. Patrick had never mentioned Morgan by name before. Patrick smiled as though commenting on the weather. He suggested, in the soft tone of a man offering helpful advice, that the presence of a decorated but unstable war veteran might raise concerns, potential liability, possible safety issues. Perhaps it would be better for everyone if such a man found residence elsewhere, a larger town maybe, or a veterans' housing center. Silas said little, but inside he felt something tighten. He did not dislike Morgan. He even respected him, though that respect carried a shadow of unease. A legend living quietly among fishermen made the town feel smaller, its mayor somehow less significant. And now financial pressure pressed against him like a vice. Patrick's proposals promised renewal, refusal promised stagnation. Silas watched Patrick leave the office, polished shoes echoing on worn wooden floors, and felt the slow burn of guilt gather behind his ribs. Later that afternoon, Silas walked through town. His gait was measured, shoulders slightly hunched beneath the invisible weight of expectation. People nodded politely. Some stopped him to discuss harbor repairs, school fundraisers, minor disputes. He listened distractedly. His thoughts were elsewhere. He saw Morgan and Rowan on the harbor path. Morgan was speaking quietly with Carl Hewitt, discussing the condition of some ropes on the southern dock. Rowan stood near, patient and regal, his silver coat bright against the muted palette of the sea. Children watched from a distance, half in awe, half in admiration. Silas hesitated. There was something deeply unsettling about a man so revered and yet so humble. It made Silas's own compromises feel louder. He approached eventually, his voice polite but guarded. Morgan greeted him simply, devoid of flattery or pretense. They spoke of small matters first: weather, fishing yields, repairs. Then Silas shifted the conversation, asking in carefully neutral tone how long Morgan intended to stay in Northwind Cove. Morgan considered before answering. There was no claim of permanence, no dramatic declaration, only a quiet statement. Here, for now, was enough. Silas nodded, but inside, doubts twisted. He imagined Patrick Lowell's poised smile. He imagined the investors' signatures and the town's fragile budget. He imagined losing control of the narrative. Pressure makes some men cruel. It made Silas cautious. That evening, in the dim lamplight of his office, he reread contracts. Each line stroked his fear. He realized that urging Morgan to leave had once seemed like a practical step toward preserving order, protecting economic hopes. Not hatred, just fear masquerading as duty. But now the town's respect for Morgan glowed like a quiet lantern. Forcing him out would tear that lantern from its place, plunging Silas into shadow. He sat there long after sunset, head bowed in his hands. The sea whispered its slow, ancient rhythm beyond the windows. He was not an evil man, only a frightened one, and fear, like the tide, can swallow more than it intends. The storm did not arrive politely. It gathered at the edge of the world like a dark thought, swelling slowly until even the sky seemed to lean away from it. By dawn, the horizon had vanished beneath a wall of roiling black clouds. The air thickened, heavy as wet cloth, tasting of metal and salt. Fishermen paused on the pier and exchanged glances that required no words. The barometer fell. The gulls scattered inland, and then, without ceremony, the wind began to roar. Northwind Cove braced itself, but nothing truly prepares a town for a storm born from the deep. Morgan Hale stood on the shoreline with Rowan beside him as the first violent gusts ripped across the harbor. Morgan's face, weathered and lined, betrayed no panic. He watched the sea with the solemn gaze of someone greeting a familiar adversary. His coat snapped loudly in the wind, and his gray hair whipped across his brow. Beneath that calm exterior, every instinct sharpened to a razor edge. Rowan stood tall, silver fur bristling, amber eyes fixed on the maelstrom. The dog did not bark. He simply listened to the storm like a creature fluent in its language. The siren sounded through the town, long and mournful. Silas Beckett rushed through the corridors of the town hall, issuing emergency orders with a trembling hand. Fear lived behind his eyes, not cowardice, but the weight of responsibility. Windows slammed shut across the town, doors were bolted, boats were hauled as far inland as cables would allow. But already the first great wave struck the pier, sending a shudder through the wooden planks, like a bone snapping beneath skin. Morgan stepped forward. His voice rose above the chaos, firm, unshakable, cutting through panic like a lighthouse beam. People listened. Men tied down loose equipment, double-knotted mooring lines, moved supplies to higher ground. Morgan moved among them effortlessly, giving orders that were simple and precise. In crisis, clarity is a gift, and he possessed it in abundance. Rowan leapt from dock to dock with astonishing balance, his paws sure on slick planks. He nudged men away from unstable crates, stood guard beside swaying fuel barrels, pacing with alert intensity. The fishermen, who once whispered mistrust, now followed the dog's movements with something close to reverence. Even in the violence of the wind, Rowan radiated purpose, steadfast, unafraid. Meanwhile, Evelyn Carter transformed her bakery into the beating heart of refuge. The building stood stout against the storm, brick walls anchored deep into the ground. Lanterns glowed warmly inside despite the darkening day. Evelyn, slight and calm, moved with quiet efficiency, ushering townsfolk into the back room where the great oven cast its gentle light. She wrapped blankets around children, guided elders to chairs, poured tea for frightened hands. Her pale braid had loosened in the growing humidity, strands clinging to her temples, but she remained steady. Years ago she had lost her husband to a storm that arrived before warnings. Since then, danger had never left her entirely, but instead of breaking her, it had carved out more space for compassion. The storm grew. Rain arrived in sheets so dense they blurred the world into gray streaks. Wind howled down the streets like an animal in pain. Signs wrenched from their posts. Windows rattled violently. The pier groaned beneath the repeated assault of waves, and ropes strained until they sang. Then came the news. A crew unaccounted for. A small boat caught beyond the safety of the cove just as the gale strengthened. No one had seen it return. Morgan turned without hesitation. Carl Hewitt and Bethany Rhodes, faces pale, jaws set, volunteered immediately. Carl's broad frame moved with grim resolve. Bethany's sharp eyes burned with determination. Loss had already touched her life once through the sea. She would not stand idle. Silas Beckett arrived breathless, rain slicking his hair flat against his head. He began to protest. The danger was unspeakable, the risk unimaginable. But when he met Morgan's gaze, the words died. In those gray eyes he saw no recklessness, only responsibility. Morgan spoke once. They went. The skiff was small, barely more than a hull and hope, but it was fast. They launched into the boiling water while waves towered around them like dark mountains. Rowan crouched at the bow, his wet fur clinging tight, muscles coiled. His ears cut through the wind, his gaze searching the chaos with relentless focus. Lightning flashed, turning the world white for a heartbeat, and then darkness swallowed everything again. The skiff climbed a monstrous swell and crashed down the other side with a bone-jarring thud. Spray slashed their faces. Carl fought the engine. Bethany clung to the rigging with rope-burned hands. Morgan stood braced, his stance sure despite the bucking deck, scanning the black horizon for any shape resembling salvation. Then Rowan stiffened. The dog's ears pricked sharply, his amber eyes fixed on a distant fragment of movement, a pale flicker against the writhing sea. He barked once, not panicked, but certain. Morgan followed his gaze. There, a crippled fishing vessel tossed like driftwood near the jagged rocks beyond the breakwater. A lone figure clung to the railing, half swallowed by waves. The boat lurched sideways, taking on water. Time fractured into urgency. Morgan guided the skiff into position, muscles and mind working in seamless union with the storm's rhythm. Carl held the throttle steady. Bethany coiled rope with ferocious concentration. And Rowan prepared himself, the embodiment of loyalty wrapped in silver, his body humming with purpose. When the moment came, Rowan leapt. He cut through the black water like a streak of moonlight, powerful limbs churning. The sea tried to devour him. He refused. He reached the drowning fisherman and anchored him with his weight, gripping the man's jacket at the shoulder, never harming, only holding. The man's terrified cries vanished beneath the storm's scream. Morgan maneuvered closer, Bethany throwing the rope with perfect instinct. Together they hauled the man aboard, his body shaking violently from cold and shock. Rowan clambered back into the skiff when called, heavy with water but unbroken. They turned for home. But the storm was not done. Rain thickened. The wind increased its fury. The sky plunged fully into night, though it was only afternoon. Lanterns along the harbor flickered like fragile souls in the darkness. barely visible through the sheets of water. Silas Beckett stood on the pier with the townspeople clustered behind him, faces pale and anxious. Each flash of lightning revealed the horror writ upon them, boats banging against pylons, debris crashing into seawalls, waves higher than any living resident could remember. Evelyn's bakery overflowed with shaking bodies. She moved among them like a quiet star, holding a baby here, wiping tears there, whispering comfort that sounded almost like prayer. Morgan's rescue skiff vanished and reappeared between heaving swells, sometimes seen, sometimes swallowed. Each glimpse brought a gasp. Each disappearance brought silence. Rowan stood at the bow as if carved from stormlight, refusing to bow to the violence around him. Then suddenly the skiff lurched violently as a wave slammed broadside. Bethany staggered. Carl cried out. Morgan seized the railing. Rowan slid, claws scraping wet wood, then regained footing, his body pressed low and determined. They would not yield. They could not. Northwind Cove waited with hearts held hostage by the sea. The storm only screamed louder, and the night had only just begun. The storm raged on as if the sky itself had been torn open. Night pressed down heavy upon Northwind Cove, though the clocks insisted it was still early evening. Wind screamed through the narrow streets, flinging spray and broken branches through the air. The sea roared with ancient fury, pounding the pier as if determined to swallow it whole. Lanterns swung wildly, casting frantic shards of light across terrified faces. All the while, Morgan Hale and Rowan remained out there in the storm, not as legends or symbols, but as two small living beings refusing to let darkness claim another life. Silas Beckett stood on the pier, rain running in sheets down his face. His neatly pressed jacket was soaked through, plastered against him like a second skin. His hair, normally combed into place, clung flat to his forehead. His wide brown eyes stared out into the chaos, searching for glimpses of the rescue skiff. Beneath the fear, guilt churned. Every decision he had made, every moment of doubt, now echoed like accusations in the storm. He had once thought that pushing Morgan away would protect the town. Now the town depended on him. Silas felt his breath hitch with shame. Another violent gust struck the pier. Boards creaked, people stumbled, someone shouted that a mooring rope had snapped. Silas turned instinctively, his body moving not with the grace of a rescuer, but with the desperate urgency of a man who could not bear to witness more loss. He headed toward the edge of the pier where the rope had broken free, flapping like a living snake in the wind. If the boat broke loose, it would slam into others, starting a chain of destruction. He reached for it. The sea struck back. A massive wave surged over the pier, striking with brutal force and sweeping Silas from his feet. His legs flew out from under him, his head cracked against wet wood, stars bursting behind his vision. Then he slid toward the edge, toward the black water waiting below, like an open mouth. He had time for one fractured thought. So this is what fear has bought me. Then he fell. The cold was immediate and savage. The sea wrapped around him like claws, dragging him beneath the surface. Salt burned his throat. Panic exploded through his chest. He kicked wildly, his heavy clothes dragging him downward. The storm roared above, uncaring. Silas gasped seawater. Darkness pressed in. And then something broke the water beside him. Rowan. The great silver dog hit the sea like a spear thrown by fate itself. His powerful body cut through the waves, his chest surging forward with relentless determination. His amber eyes burned with fierce loyalty. He swam toward Silas without hesitation, without fear. Morgan was there moments later, plunging into the freezing water with the same grim certainty. His body obeyed long-trained instincts. Pain flared in his injured leg, but he ignored it. He reached Silas just as Rowan grasped the mare's jacket collar gently, but firmly, anchoring him. Silas flailed weakly, choking, half-conscious. Morgan wrapped an arm around him and shouted through clenched teeth to hold still. The storm did not soften. Waves crashed, rolling them beneath the surface, hurling them against the side of the pier. The world narrowed into a brutal struggle between muscle and water. Rowan swam in tight circles when needed, pushing his body between Silas and jagged debris, taking the impact himself. The dog fought with every ounce of strength, his silver fur plastered tight to his frame, breath coming harsh and fast. Above them, Carl Hewitt and Bethany Rhodes dropped ropes down the side of the pier, their faces ghostly in the lightning glow. Hands reached. Shouts rang out. A final surge of will carried the three souls upward, one lift at a time, until at last Silas was hauled out of the sea and onto the slick boards of the pier. Morgan emerged seconds later, breath heaving, body shaking with cold. Rowan scrambled up last, claws scraping, chest heaving, yet still alert, still focused, still unwilling to rest, until Morgan was safe. Silas lay on his back, coughing out seawater, eyes wild with shock. For a long moment, all he could do was gasp at the storm-filled sky, realizing he could have slipped quietly into oblivion and never known the ending. When he rolled onto his side, he saw Morgan kneeling beside Rowan, checking the dog's limbs with trembling hands. There was nothing dramatic in it, just care. Fierce, unwavering care. And Silas felt something inside him crack open. Not fear, not ambition. Conscience. He saw, as if for the first time, the truth he had been avoiding. Morgan had risked his life for him, the very man who had once wished him gone. Rowan had leapt into a death sea, not for heroism, not for reward, but because loyalty was woven into his bones. Silas pushed himself upright slowly, his whole body shuddering. He looked at Morgan. Really looked. He saw not the legend, not the decorated commander, but a weary man who still chose compassion over safety. He saw Rowan, an aging shepherd with a scar around his neck, who had chosen love over fear. Silas began to cry. Not loudly, not theatrically, just quietly, like a tide receding from a long-held shore. The storm howled. Water lashed the pier. But within Silas something gentler rose like light behind a cloud. The ambition that had driven him, the desire to reshape the town through deals and signatures, suddenly felt hollow compared to the raw, human truth before him. He realized that leadership was not power. Leadership was responsibility to the souls that trusted you. Patrick Lowell and his shining brochures had never mentioned souls. Silas bowed his head and whispered a promise into the roaring wind, a vow meant as much for himself as for the storm. He would not sell Northwind Cove, not its land, not its people, not its heart, because a town that forgets its humanity loses far more than coastline. Carl wrapped a blanket around Silas. Bethany placed a steady hand on his shoulder. Neither judged him. The storm had stripped them all down to something simpler than politics or pride. Silas looked again at Morgan. "Thank you," he said softly, voice raw. Morgan nodded once. That was enough. Rowan rested his head briefly against Silas's knee as if in quiet benediction, then returned faithfully to Morgan's side. All around them, the storm continued without mercy. Waves hammered the shore. The wind screamed. Lanterns flickered like the last candles in a cathedral of darkness. But something had changed. Silas Beckett had remembered he still possessed a heart. And hearts, even fragile ones, carry light. The storm could not touch that. Not now. Not ever. Morning came quietly to Northwind Cove, as if the storm had finally exhausted its fury and collapsed into sleep. The sky was a pale wash of silver blue, the air still damp with the memory of rain. Shattered shingles, broken crates, and pieces of driftwood lay scattered across the harbor like the afterthoughts of a restless ocean. Fishermen walked the shore in tired silence, gathering fragments of lives that had nearly been swept away. The gulls had returned, circling lazily as if nothing extraordinary had occurred. In the gentle hush, the sea sounded different than before, not angry, but reflective, as though it too was remembering the night when everything almost fell apart. Morgan Hale stood at the top of the hill overlooking town, leaning slightly on a sturdy walking stick he had fashioned from driftwood. His tall, weathered frame seemed carved out of the same rock that shaped the cliffs. His silver hair lifted faintly in the cool breeze, and the faint lines around his eyes spoke of long years spent under harsher skies. Beside him sat Rowan, the German shepherd with the noble silver coat and calm amber eyes. The dog rested quietly but alert, ears always turning toward distant sounds. His loyalty was no longer a secret or a subject of suspicion. The town now spoke his name in soft tones, with respect. Down in the town square, the old flagpole had been straightened again, and the people of North Wind Cove gathered not for mourning, but for something softer, something hopeful. A white van, marked with the emblem of the Veterans Relief Foundation, was parked nearby. 2 representatives stood beside it. The first was Margaret Collins, a woman in her late 50s with cropped steel-gray hair and a strong but kind gaze. She had spent decades advocating for veterans, and the calm steadiness in her voice came from years of listening to too many stories of quiet suffering. The second man was Thomas Reed, younger, somewhere in his late 30s, tall, clean-shaven, with hands that fidgeted when he was nervous. He had lost an older brother in service and carried the grief like a quiet shadow wherever he went. When the townspeople learned who Morgan truly was, these 2 had arrived with funds, resources, and the kind of support that was not charity, but gratitude. Silas Beckett walked toward the gathering group, looking smaller somehow than he had before the storm. His once pressed suits were gone, replaced with a heavy work jacket and worn boots, the clothing of a man who intended to repair what he had broken. His dark hair now carried a permanent streak of worry-born gray at the temples. Every step he took seemed weighted with humility, but also with resolve. He had rescinded every deal, canceled every agreement, and stood before the town to admit fault. The townsfolk, though still cautious, had begun to soften. Forgiveness takes time, but the seed had been planted. And Evelyn Carter was there too. Evelyn, with her warm brown eyes and hair streaked softly with silver, wore a pale blue cardigan and flour-dusted slacks out of sheer habit. Her smile no longer held only sorrow, though the memory of her lost husband still lingered gently behind her gaze. Years of running the bakery alone had given her a quiet strength. She had watched Morgan with a care that surprised even herself, as though recognizing the loneliness in him long before anyone else did. The plan formed naturally. The Veterans Organization would provide funding. The townspeople would contribute labor and time, and together they would build something small, sturdy, and full of meaning. A cottage for Morgan and Rowan. Not out of pity, but out of recognition, out of gratitude, out of the belief that a man who had given so much deserved a place where the world finally stopped demanding things from him. They found the spot along the hill that curved gently toward the ocean, where the grass grew long and soft, and wildflowers nudged their way through sandy soil each spring. From there, the sea opened wide like a painted horizon, endless and unknowable, and yet somehow peaceful now. Morgan watched quietly as the first planks were delivered, as hammers struck nails, as neighbors who once whispered sideways glances now shared laughter and work gloves. Old Henry Lawson, a fisherman with a beard the color of storm clouds and hands calloused like worn leather, measured out the frame. Bethany Rhodes painted shutters a deep ocean blue. Young Jake Miller, barely 20, carried shingle bundles up the slope with the exuberance of youth. Even Silas joined, lifting beams shoulder to shoulder with men who still remembered his mistakes, and yet allowed him the grace of redemption. Morgan did not speak much. Words were never his first language. But he worked. He sanded boards. He steadied ladders. He measured again when others grew impatient. And always Rowan trotted near, supervising like a solemn foreman, pausing only when children approached to bury their hands into his thick fur. Where once parents had pulled them away in fear, Now they smiled. Rowan would stand still, patient, tail gently sweeping the grass, as if he understood this, too, was part of the healing. By the time the cottage stood complete, the sky had deepened into evening lavender. The house was modest, a single bedroom, a stone fireplace, wooden floors that creaked softly like welcoming whispers. On the porch, a rocking chair faced the sculpted curve of the ocean. It was not grand. It did not need to be. It was home, a word that had once belonged only to memory. The townspeople gathered for no ceremony in particular, just a quiet acknowledgment. Thomas Reed shook Morgan's hand firmly, the gratitude in his eyes spoken without sound. Margaret Collins placed her palm gently on his shoulder, the touch full of respect between warriors who had seen more than they ever wished to. Evelyn brought warm bread wrapped in cloth, placing it on the small wooden table inside. For a moment she hesitated at the doorway, unsure if she was crossing into private ground, until Morgan turned and nodded. Rowan padded past them, choosing immediately the spot beside the porch rail where the wind carried the smell of salt and pine. He lay down slowly, exhaling like a guardian finally permitted to rest. Silas approached last. He looked as though he had rehearsed something, but when he opened his mouth, the words tangled and fell away. So instead, he said only what mattered. "Thank you." And he meant it not only for the storm, but for the grace Morgan had shown him, the grace that had changed the course of a man's life. When evening settled into night and lanterns flickered along the slope, the townsfolk drifted away to their homes. The world grew soft and hushed. Waves whispered against the shore, gentle now, more lullaby than warning. Morgan sat in the rocking chair, the wood creaking beneath him. He breathed in the scent of the ocean, the mountain air, the faint sweetness of Evelyn's bread drifting through the open window. For the first time in decades, his shoulders loosened. Not because the world had grown less dangerous, but because for once it was not asking him to save it. Rowan shifted on the porch, his head lifting briefly when a nightbird called. His ears twitched. His eyes closed again. His chest rose and fell in slow, calm rhythm. The silver dog was home too. And in the quiet, Morgan realized something simple. After years of war, duty, wandering, and being both misunderstood and quietly brave, he no longer had to keep moving. The world had stopped. The sea sang softly below the hill, and somewhere in that song was peace. He whispered 2 words to the night. Thank you, not to any one person, but to life itself for granting him this final harbor. The house watched the sea watched the shore, and Rowan, faithful to the end, guarded the threshold between them. Morgan Hale, soldier, wanderer, survivor, had finally come home. Here, at the quiet end of the story, when the waves have finished telling their long tale and the wind rests like a folded prayer, one simple truth remains. Grace often arrives wearing ordinary clothes. A weary soldier, a silver dog, a small town that remembers how to open its doors. And somewhere within all of it, the gentle whisper of God, moving like light across the water. Morgan Hale did not ask for a miracle, yet one was given anyway. Not the loud kind that splits the sky, but the softer kind. Hearts changing, forgiveness awakening, a home being built nail by human hands, guided by unseen love. It is the kind of blessing that reminds us that God still walks quietly among us through compassion, loyalty, and the courage to begin again. Rowan's faithfulness, Evelyn's kindness, Silas's repentance, and the town's unity speak to a truth older than the tides. When people choose mercy over judgment, heaven draws near. And sometimes God does not calm the storm right away. Sometimes he strengthens the people who stand inside it, teaching them that even in the fiercest darkness, his light is not lost. In everyday life, miracles still unfold in small corners of the world. They live in the helping hand, the forgiving word, the heart that refuses to turn away. Perhaps God is closer than we think, listening to every tired prayer, guiding every wandering soul back toward home. If this story touched you, share your thoughts below so that others may feel encouraged too. Leave a comment, share the message, and subscribe if you would like to walk with us through more stories of hope and faith. And if your heart agrees with the simple truth that God still works through love, write this word in the comments. Amen. May the Lord bless every person reading these words, protect your families, and grant peace to every restless heart.